Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, May 5th, 2023. U.S. economy adds 253,000 jobs in April, and the unemployment rate drops from 3.5% to 3.4%, a 54-year low. Just ahead, President Joe Biden talks about the Labor Department jobs report and his ongoing disagreement with House Republicans over whether to include federal spending cuts in a bill to raise the country's debt ceiling before the U.S. defaults. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas in Brownsville, Texas, on the U.S. Mexico border, says migrants should know that the end next week of Title 42, the COVID-era rule that allows expulsion of migrants seeking asylum, does not mean the border is open. But he says the Biden administration is preparing for an expected large increase in those migrants trying to enter the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky says she's leaving her job at the end of June. And the end of the COVID-19 public health emergency next week makes this a good time for a transition. Campaign 2024 will hear from former Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton about President Biden's re-election run, and from Bill Barr, former Attorney General in the Trump administration, on Donald Trump again seeking the Republican nomination for president. Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. talks about the head of the Russian mercenary Wagner group feuding with the Russian defense minister, threatening to withdraw his forces from a pivotal battle in the war in Ukraine. And King Charles III's coronation is Saturday. We'll talk to C-SPAN's London producer, Peter Knowles, about the ceremony, the pageantry, and the role of the modern British monarchy. From the Wall Street Journal, Americans landed jobs and their wages increased in April, showing the labor market is resilient amid banking turmoil, rising interest rates, and high inflation. President Biden tweeting, "We just learned we created 253,000 jobs in April. That's 12.7 million jobs since I took office, an unemployment rate that is the lowest since 1969 and the highest share of working-age people in the workforce since 2008. My plan to invest in America is working." The president later spoke at a White House meeting of department secretaries and advisors. He calls his Investing in America cabinet.
This morning, we got some good news from the jobs report. We added 250,000 jobs last month. That's on top of the 12 million jobs we've already added just since we came in office a little over 2 years ago. Unemployment rate is at 3.4%, which is the lowest in 50 years. Black employment has hit a record low. And the really good news is working age Americans are participating in the labor force at the highest rate in 15 years, not just since the pandemic, in 15 years. And the working age women are participating at the highest rate in 75 years. Inflation is now down 40% since last summer. It's come down the last 9 months in a row. We obviously have more work to do, but we're trending in the right direction. And I think we're making real progress. And we're doing it basically, which was the theme of everything we're internally working on, by investing in America. Say it again, investing in America. Matter of fact, the Secretary and I were just talking about a project that was taking place in another state, and the reason that we're having a significant investment in America, they said, well, we can't build this unless we go ahead and contract out for a lot of work. He said, no, I'm not going to do that way. Well, guess what? I figured out how to do it in America at the right price, at the right time, at the right date. And so we got a lot more work to do to make, but we're making real progress.
President Biden at an Investing in America cabinet meeting at the White House. The president also talked about what he says is the need to continue investing in America, and that means not cutting federal spending, as House Republicans have suggested as part of raising the nation's debt ceiling to avoid a default. Treasury Department estimates that default could happen as early as June 1st.
Unfortunately, I won't say Republican because I think they're pretty well divided, but our MAGA Republicans in Congress are threatening to do all this progress by letting us, quote, default on the debt unless we agree to their demands. The two are totally unrelated. Whether you pay the debt or not doesn't have a damn thing to do with what your budget is. What your budget is. Where you're going to spend money, how you're going to raise the money, what are you going to cut, they're two separate issues, too. And let's get it straight. They're trying to hold the debt hostage to us to agree to some draconian cuts, magnificently difficult and damaging cuts. But I'll get into that in a little bit. But unfortunately, they're threatening to undo all this progress by letting us default. Their budget that they proposed, that was attached to their debt ceiling increase, but they tied them together now. I want to make that clear. You all know this, I know, but for the listeners, they've tied it together. They say we're not going to increase the debt that every president has done for the last 6 million years here. Never hadn't done anything but that, unless you pass our budget as we're proposing. Now, their budget would put 21 million people at risk of losing Medicaid. It would cut federal law enforcement by 28,000 personnel. 28,000, FBI, DEA, etc. It would cut 100,000 teachers and support staff. It would cut 30 million veterans health care visits. And I increased the VA budget because the veterans were in such difficult shape, having so much trouble getting appointments and the like. According to Moody's, not the Democratic Party, according to Moody's, their budget plan would eliminate 780,000 jobs. Say it again, it would eliminate 780,000 jobs, according to Moody's. And America's debt has accumulated over 200 years, and my predecessor, in the 4 years he was president, increased it by that total debt by 40%.
President Biden at the White House. He has invited the House and Senate Republican and Democratic leaders to meet next Tuesday to discuss the debt ceiling. Today, members of the House Republican Main Street Caucus posted a video calling on the president to negotiate spending as part of a debt ceiling increase. You'll hear from the caucus chair, Dusty Johnson of South Dakota, the vice chair, Stephanie Bice of Oklahoma, and then about a dozen more of the 70 or so total members of the caucus.
In 6 weeks, our nation defaults on our debts. We're also $32 trillion in debt. The pragmatic conservatives of the Republican Main Street Caucus know that these are issues that must be addressed now.
More than 80 days ago, Speaker McCarthy and President Biden sat down to talk about making progress on the debt ceiling. Since then, President Biden has refused to come to the table.
House Republicans did our job and passed the Limit, Save, Grow Act. Mr. President, it's time to do yours and come to the table to discuss this legislation.
House Republicans have been the adults in the room and passed a sensible debt ceiling solution that strengthens our economy.
Mr. President, it's time to get in the game.
House Republicans have done our job by passing the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. It's now time for President Biden to come to the table and negotiate.
Mr. President, it's time to negotiate.
We can't default on our debts. Mr. President, negotiate.
Come back to the table, let's negotiate, and let's get something done for the American people. Quit paying politics, let's get it done.
Mr. President, Republicans did our jobs. It's time for you to do yours.
Mr. President, we cannot default on our debts. It is time to negotiate, sir.
We're protecting the American farmer. We're protecting our biofuels to help secure the future, and it's time for you to do your job.
Our national debt is an existential crisis for our country.
President Biden, it's time to get to the negotiating table.
Mr. President, Republicans have done our job. Now it's time for you to do yours. Come to the table and negotiate with Speaker McCarthy.
The American people are waiting.
It's time to come to the table and negotiate.
Our country needs us to solve this problem. If we don't, we're going to have a fiscal house of cards that will collapse someday, and our kids and grandkids. It's not right.
It's time to negotiate. The House did its job, Mr. President. You and Leader Schumer need to come to the table and negotiate with Speaker McCarthy in good faith.
Compilation video from the House Republican Main Street Caucus posted today, ahead of next Tuesday's White House meeting with the president and bipartisan congressional leaders on the debt ceiling. On Wall Street, the Dow up 546, NASDAQ up 269, S&P up 75. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas holding a news conference in Brownsville, Texas today on immigration and border security. He has been touring the U.S. Mexico border the past 2 days, meeting with law enforcement and reviewing contingency plans for when COVID-19 pandemic-era Title 42 immigration restrictions end 1 week from today, May 11th. And the estimates are that up to 10,000 migrants per day could then cross the border. Secretary Mayorkas said that the Biden administration has been increasing lawful paths for migrants to come to the U.S., and those who try to come through non-lawful means will be subject to removal under the long-standing Title VIII.
The message is very clear. We are coming with the relief that our laws provide to the individuals in need. The border is not open. It has not been open, and it will not be open subsequent to May 11th. And the smugglers who exploit vulnerable migrants are spreading misinformation. They are spreading false information, lies, in a way to lure vulnerable people to the southern border, and those individuals will only be returned. To the individuals themselves who are thinking of migrating, do not believe the smugglers. Please access the official government publications. Please access the official government information on the Department of Homeland Security website for accurate information, because you are being deceived and you are risking your lives and your life savings only to meet a consequence that you do not expect at our southern border. To meet our objectives, we have been and continue to surge resources, personnel, transportation capabilities, airplanes to effect a greater number of removals every week, additional facilities, the remarkable facility that the United States Border Patrol set up here in collaboration with the community of Brownsville. This was set up in just 72 hours. We are surging resources.
Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, news conference today in Brownsville, Texas. A reporter asked him about changes to the asylum process.
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. You mentioned after May 11th there would be, quote, a higher burden of proof that the migrants would need to show to have exceptions. Could you expand upon that? Could you also talk about the credible fear interviews and the processes that you're going through to expedite these migrants, so many?
So the rule is being finalized, and until that rule is indeed final and published, it is difficult for me to answer the question just as a matter of law, because it is not set, it is not established until it is actually final and published. But the general concept is as follows: that individuals who access the lawful pathways that we deliver for them will be able to come to the United States in a safe and orderly way. Those who travel irregularly in the hands of smugglers, because I have to repeat again, it is a security and humanitarian imperative that we cut the smugglers out. Those who arrive irregularly at our border will be presumed, absent some limited exceptions, will be presumed to be ineligible for asylum, and they will meet a rebuttable presumption of ineligibility. To overcome that presumption, they will have to meet a higher threshold of proof.
Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas in Brownsville, Texas. From CBS News, a group of senators on Thursday unveiled a bill that would allow U.S. border agents to continue expelling migrants without court hearings, even after a public health order that has authorized these expulsions during the coronavirus pandemic expires next week. In a statement, Republican North Carolina Senator Tom Tillis said he was introducing the proposal with independent Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema due to a lack of confidence in the Biden administration's plan to handle the expected rise in migration to the southern border when Title 42 lifts. That from CBS News. Also Thursday, before the Senate adjourned for the weekend, Senator John Hoeven, Republican from North Dakota, spoke on the Senate floor.
The Biden administration needs to implement the migrant protection protocols, or the Remain in Mexico policy, which required people seeking asylum at our southern border to wait in Mexico while their case is adjudicated. Second, reinstate the Safe Third Country Agreement, which requires that individuals coming from places like El Salvador or Honduras, Guatemala, that they seek asylum in their own country first, or they are returned to their country to await the outcome of their claim. Now, Title 42 expires on May 11th. Border is already in crisis, and it will just get worse. But the reality is, if those two policies are reinstated, then the Customs and Border Protection professionals can get on top of the problem. In other words, let them do their job. Put in place border policies that will enable our Customs and Border Protection professionals to do their job. It's been shown that those policies will work. I just gave you the numbers going back to 2020. We're not guessing on this. We're not guessing. We know it works. Those two policy changes will enable our Customs and Border Protection professionals to get control of the border. And with Title 42 expiring on May 11th, they need to be implemented now. We have to do more. We need a border wall, we need personnel, we need technology. All those things need to be part of creating a secure border. But right now, particularly with Title 42 expiring, we need to implement those two policy changes and enable our Customs and Border Protection professionals to do their job. Border security is national security.
Senator John Hoeven, Republican from North Dakota, on the Senate floor on Thursday. From Associated Press, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, the head of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, submitted her resignation Friday, saying the waning of the COVID-19 pandemic was a good time to make a transition. Her last day will be June 30th, CDC officials said, and an interim director wasn't immediately named. She sent a resignation letter to President Joe Biden and announced the decision at a CDC staff meeting. Dr. Walensky, 54 years old, has been the agency's director for a little over 2 years. Reporting from the Associated Press, on Thursday, Dr. Walensky testified before the Senate Health Committee about preparations for the next pandemic.
The approaching end of the public health emergency once again reminds us that policy changes and funding are essential to the readiness of future biothreats. CDC will continue to closely monitor COVID-19 and provide the information to which we have access. After 3 years of the pandemic and 3 months to prepare for the end of the PHE, we have worked hard to sustain the data to understand what's happening with the virus in America. But the end of the PHE means that CDC will no longer be able to collect data and share information many Americans have come to expect. As CDC often does, we will adapt to limitations and utilize tried and true systems to monitor other respiratory diseases to keep our eye on COVID-19. In some cases, CDC will rely on data that we have demonstrated are a reasonable surrogate, but there are data we will no longer have available because they will no longer be submitted to us. For example, certain data for a national picture of health disparities, both for race and ethnicity and along urban and rural lines. We will make do. However, this should worry us all.
CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky testifying before the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee on Thursday. She announced today that she is resigning at the end of June. President Biden, in a statement, saying Dr. Walensky has saved lives with her steadfast and unwavering focus on the health of every American. But there were some critics. This story from The Hill. As more Americans were vaccinated and restrictions around the pandemic eased, Dr. Walensky and the agency came under scrutiny for how it conveyed new information to the public. In May 2021, the CDC changed its guidelines to state that fully vaccinated individuals did not have to wear a mask indoors, a move that was criticized by some health experts for muddling the message around the state of the pandemic and changing the guidance too quickly when many Americans were still not vaccinated. The World Health Organization has officially declared an end to the COVID-19 global health emergency. It was first declared on January 30th, 2020. WHO Secretary General is Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus.
Yesterday, the Emergency Committee met for the 15th time and recommended to me that I declare an end to the public health emergency of international concern. I have accepted that advice. It's therefore with great hope that I declare COVID-19 over as a global health emergency. However, That does not mean COVID-19 is over as a global health threat.
WHO leader Dr. Tedros at a news conference in Geneva. An Associated Press explainer article asks, is COVID-19 still a pandemic? And then answers, yes. Although WHO chief Dr. Tedros said the coronavirus emergency was over, he warned the virus is here to stay and that thousands of people continue to die every week. You're listening to Washington Today. Some thoughts today on the 2024 presidential election from former Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton and Bill Barr, former Attorney General in the administration of Donald Trump and also of George H.W. Bush. Hillary Clinton spoke at a meeting in Washington hosted by the group Vital Voices, of which she is a co-founder, about President Biden's re-election.
Is an 80-year-old white man disrupting the status quo as a potential Democratic nominee representing that party?
Well, I think as president, he has disrupted the status quo. And now he has a record that he's running on. And, you know, I was in the Senate for 8 years. And so I have a real understanding of how difficult it was to get accomplished, to get past the legislation that he did. And that legislation, whether it's building, you know, roads and ports and airports and broadband and all the rest of it, or whether it is building the manufacturing of the future with the so-called CHIPS bill, or clean energy, will employ millions and millions of Americans. So the economic investments that are being made because of President Biden's very singular focus on helping us to have the economy of the future is really disruptive. Because, you know, the prior president, he who shall remain nameless, he must have said the word infrastructure a million times. Infrastructure, you know. Never did a thing about it. Because it was hard, you know? So talk is cheap, action is valuable. That, to me, is disruptive because we're currently in a period in our country's history where we think we can't get stuff done because nobody will listen and nobody will talk and nobody will compromise and nobody will stay and actually, you know,
do we see that changing?
Work. Well, I think Joe Biden has proven it. I mean, I don't think he gets the credit that he deserves from the press or, you know, maybe some large segments of the people, but literally, he got a lot done in 2 years in very difficult circumstances, including an insurrection at the Capitol to try to prevent him from being president. That is disruptive in the best sense of the word. That is, you know, I know that it's not easy. I know that, you know, a lot of folks didn't vote for me. I know that some people were literally trying to prevent me from being president. I'm going to get up every day, no matter my age, and we're going to get stuff done. I love that.
Yeah, thank you.
Former Democratic presidential nominee, Secretary of State, and Senator Hillary Clinton, co-founder of the group Vital Voices, which held today's program in Washington on women leaders. Former Attorney General Bill Barr was at the City Club of Cleveland, asked about former President Donald Trump's run to regain the office.
General Barr, welcome to Cleveland.
Yeah.
And thank you for your public service. What is your advice? What would be your advice to all of us in yours and my party, dealing with the fact that there's this, and this is my choice of words, a stranglehold by a big core of the party that it's Trump or nothing. How can we what can we do as a party to get this way where more candidates can be viable and be heard, and to turn the chances of the party around to possibly a victory. The two announced candidates are barely getting nowhere. All the polls show single digits for most of these. What does the party do? What can the party do? What do you recommend the party do to get away from this one-man situation?
Well, I think it comes down to obviously this primary. I personally believe that Trump will not be the nominee. I think that he will be beaten. And I think a lot of what's going on now is actually a chimera. It conceals what I think are the basic dynamics. A lot of Republicans are abandoning his ship, and because they want to win. I think a lot of Republicans value what he did. They give him credit for a lot of the things he did. They also know he's his own worst enemy and that he actually brings out more votes than he brings in. That's just a fact of life. And so so because they recognize, I think, how important this election is and that they will not win the election with him at the helm, I don't think he's going to end up getting the nomination. And I just think, now speaking parochially among Republicans, I think people have to, I said, actually when I first came into the government, I said, the MAGA movement's going to have to grow up. And by that I wasn't being condescending. It has to mature. People understand why you want to be mad and send a message and poke someone in the eye, but that's not what the country needs. We need to build. We don't need a wrecking ball. We also have to return to the politics of persuasion. Trump isn't interested in persuading anyone. Trump is, as the questioner said, is interested in holding this part of the Republican Party and then extorting the rest of the party to go along with him, because otherwise I'll pick up my ball and go home. I think the question has to be called now, even if he does pick up his ball and go home, because the consequences of him getting the nomination, one, he will lose. He will lose the election. He will not only lose, because in none of the states that were up for grabs is any closer to go with him. In fact, they're further away from him. He will not only lose himself, but he will bring out so many votes in states like New York and California that the Republicans will get devastated in the houses of Congress, especially in the House of Representatives. Our margin is because are from states like New York and California. Okay, he will do that. He will then bring in someone to be his vice president on the ticket who is not of first caliber, because anyone worth their salt is not going to agree to be his vice president after what he did to Mike Pence. So he's going to bring in some sort of Looney Tunes person, and that person will then become the standard bearer of MAGA, and we're sort of back where we started from. So I think the question has to be called in this election, and people have to start seeing that this is really nothing more than a cult of personality, and that we have other serious candidates who have most of the same policies and don't have all the baggage. If it doesn't happen, maybe the Democrats will be happy, but I don't think Republicans will be for a long time.
Former Attorney General Bill Barr at the City Club of Cleveland in Cleveland. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Early Saturday morning, the coronation of King Charles III will take place. He became the King of the United Kingdom following the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, the UK's longest reigning monarch. C-SPAN will air the BBC's coverage of the coronation in its entirety at 4 p.m. Eastern, from the royal procession to Westminster Abbey to the official crowning of the new king. The coronation of King Charles III, Saturday at 4 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN or online at cspan.org.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. A story from Reuters. Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of Russia's Wagner Group mercenary force, said in a dramatic announcement on Friday that his forces would pull out of the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut that they had been trying to capture since last summer. He said they would withdraw on May 10th, ending their involvement in the longest and bloodiest battle of the war, because of heavy losses and inadequate ammunition supplies. He asked defense chiefs to insert regular army troops in their place. The Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova, was asked today about this at an appearance at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington.
Your country is under attack from the Russian army, but also from something called the Wagner Group, which is called a mercenary army, but it's not hired by just anybody. It's hired by, it works for Putin, but it's two separate armies. So Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's the head of the Wagner Group, there's a Telegram video of him. You've shown it to me. I've seen it. It's really extraordinary. If you haven't seen this, you should look, because it's Prigozhin, and behind him are corpses. His troops dead on a battlefield, very bloody, and he is railing against Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, saying, I'm going to have to pull my troops from Bakhmut because you won't give me the ammunition I need to fight the Ukrainians. This is really this is an extraordinary thing. I mean, imagine in the U.S. if, two generals went after each other in the U.S. Army on the record like that. I'm just interested in your thoughts on this. Extraordinary.
Well, yes, first of all, again, during this very difficult time when Russia reinvaded Ukraine, right? Because, they started the war with us in 2014. But during this, almost 15 months of the full-fledged phase of this war, all Russian criminals, and that's the armed forces and the conscripts and Prigozhin and other, like Wagner groups and other groups, which call themselves mercenaries. But, of course, they are there because the Russian government told them and the Russian president told them to be there, have always been bragging about how they will take Bakhmut. I mean, it's been there. The fight in the east has been particularly brutal. And to see him, publicly, on the record, attacking other part of the war criminal group that is actually waging the war in Ukraine, is actually, saying the truth, first of all, that he is disclosing the fact that they are running out of ammunition. So it means sanctions are working. It also means that, there is an opening for us to continue what we have to do to liberate our country. Now, how shall we interpret this? How shall we look at this? And how we Ukrainians look at this? It just proves that all the priorities on which we are working with U.S. first and foremost, but also other allies, weapons, more weapons to us, more financial and other support for us to be able to faster liberate our land, but also more sanctions to Russia. This is what we should be thinking about, that we have to double down because we can win it faster. And I think we shall see more of that. Because again, what are Russians are fighting for there? Right. I mean, of course, there are many more of them. They have more equipment. Let's not underestimate the enemy. But, all our soldiers, men and women who are defending our homes, there is a very clear motivation there. This is the only homes we have, and we will defend them with everything we have. What is their motivation to wage an aggressive, unfair war and war crimes in Ukraine? There is none.
Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Markarova, with Clifford May, Foundation for Defense of Democracy's founder and president. From CNN, this story, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu inspected troops and military equipment in Russia's southern military district on Friday, the Russian military said, amid a very public feud with the head of the Wagner private military company. The statement from Minister Shoigu has instructed to keep under special control the issues of continuous and rhythmic supply of the groups of troops in the area of the special military operation with all the necessary weapons and military equipment. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking today at a State Department ceremony to place memorial plaques for 2 members of the Foreign Service who have died related to their time overseas. The American Foreign Service Association website explains the establishment of these plaques grew out of AFSA's efforts starting in the late 1920s to establish a roll of honor of colleagues who had died in circumstances distinctive to overseas service, including due to violence, natural disasters, tropical diseases, and accidents during official travel. Here's Secretary Blinken.
Right now, around the world, our colleagues are working in war zones, under foreign surveillance, amidst humanitarian crises, in the aftermath of natural disasters. Some experience serious accidents abroad. Others are exposed to severe illness or health hazards. Some of our LGBTQI colleagues serve in places where they and their partners don't feel safe to be their full selves. Just this week, we lost a treasured local staff member at Embassy Lisbon, Rui Noronha, who died in the course of his duty. His family's loss is our loss too. But our diplomats face these situations with tremendous heart, with compassion, with decency, focusing not on themselves, but on helping the people around them. who often go through some of the hardest days of their lives. Simply put, that's our mission. And for generations, our diplomats have carried on despite danger, despite difficulty. Nowhere is that devotion more clearly illustrated than in the 312 individuals honored on our memorial walls, those who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. This year, we pay special tribute to two more members of the Foreign Service, Thomas Wallace and Elbridge Lee, both of whom died from COVID-19 in 2021.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken today at the State Department. The American Foreign Service Association website lists all the names of those who lost their lives serving the U.S. government and the American people abroad in foreign affairs. A total of 321, plus the two names added today. The first name on the list, William Palfrey, lost at sea, 1780. The coronation of King Charles III of Great Britain is Saturday. C-SPAN will be re-airing 7 hours of the ceremony and the procession through the streets of London, starting at 4 p.m. Eastern. On Thursday, the White House Press Secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, said at her White House news conference that First Lady Jill Biden will be representing the United States.
First Lady Jill Biden is traveling today to the United Kingdom to attend the coronation of His Majesty King Charles III and Her Majesty Queen Consort Camilla on behalf of the United States. The U.S. and the United Kingdom are close allies and strong partners with enduring ties between our countries and peoples. The First Lady is honored to represent the United States for this historic moment. In addition to attending the coronation and participating in coronation activities, the First Lady will also meet with Mrs. Murty, spouse of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. She will also join the Prime Minister and Mrs. Murty for their coronation big lunch. Her full schedule was released by the First Lady's office earlier this morning.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre on Thursday. With a closer look at the coronation of King Charles III, we're joined from London by C-SPAN's producer in Great Britain, Peter Knowles. Welcome back to Washington today. So what will the coronation look and sound like? And in the context of a modern monarchy and one shaped by the priorities of this king, what messages is it designed to convey?
We're going to see a mix of the medieval and the reasonably modern. So the event comprises 3 parts. There's a procession from Buckingham Palace to the Abbey, and that to Westminster Abbey, and that's a smaller procession. The procession back is full scale with many more participants from around the Commonwealth, followed by an appearance on the balcony with family members. We don't yet know which ones, and a fly past. In between, we have the coronation service itself. And I think the thing to stress there is that it is a Christian service of crowning the king and anointing him. It's led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it follows medieval rites. So it's the only coronation of its kind in Europe. There are other kings and queens in Europe, but they have thoroughly modernized. This, at its heart, is a medieval service. But where it's more modern is that they have torn up the guest list from the last coronation, which was all of 70 years ago. And instead of the event being very heavy and dominated by the presence of hereditary peers, there will be a few of them with leading roles, but most of the hereditary peers are not on the guest list, and instead you have charity leaders, charity workers, and a more representative population from the country. So that is sending a more modern message, and as well as the oaths of allegiance that are sworn by the king, to the king, by the Archbishop of Canterbury and by his son, the Prince of Wales, and the oath sworn by the king to rule faithfully and in the interests of the people and according to their respective laws and customs. But besides all that, there's also acknowledgement of a multi-faith dimension of the presence of other faiths in this country. It is no longer simply a Christian country as the perception was 70 years ago. And that acknowledgement of people of all faiths is there right at the beginning of the service and right at the end of it as well. So it is a mix of old and new. But physically, I mean, there's some pretty old stuff going on. There's an 18th century stagecoach that is used for the journey back from Westminster Abbey. And there is a chair, the coronation chair, which dates to 1300. And underneath it is the Stone of Destiny from Scotland, which was used long before 1300 for the crowning of the Scottish kings. So there's a fair mix of old and new.
Great Britain has been a worldwide power in many senses over the centuries. What world leaders will be attending this coronation, and what's the role of the Commonwealth?
Sure. Of the significant attendees, President Macron is coming from France. There is a representative of the Chinese leader, somewhat controversial one, a Vice President Han Zheng, and he is the man who is credited with the thorough suppression of pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. So that's an interesting bit of politics going on between China and the UK there. President Biden, of course, is not coming. His wife is. The First Lady is coming, but he's missing. And that maintains a tradition that goes back right to the independence of the United States. There has been no president of the U.S. present at a coronation since the beginning. I did the maths on this, and that turns out that with across 46 presidents, this will be the 8th coronation from which they've been absent, which is interesting, and that speaks to the incredibly long reigns we saw from Queen Victoria and then Queen Elizabeth. So those are some of the world leaders present and not present. One really interesting domestic presentee is Michelle O'Neill, who by electoral rights should be the First Minister of Northern Ireland. She's the leading Sinn Féin Republican politician in Northern Ireland. She says she'll be coming, and that was genuinely quite a surprise. But she says, well, look, I represent all of the people of Northern Ireland, not just my side of the sectarian divide. So she said she'll be there. And then, of course, there's the family, the family members who are there, and the ones who are not. Prince Harry is coming. Meghan, not so. There is a 4-year-old's birthday party to take care of tomorrow.
At these moments in the British monarchy transition, we always ask, do the British people continue to support having a monarchy?
They do. The simple answer is yes. If you look at some very detailed polling that's recently been done, with a very large sample, the polling is close to 2/3, 1/3 in favour of the monarchy versus in favour of a republic. But beneath the surface of that, there's a lot of variation. So the younger age group is much less enthusiastic about the monarchy, and the older age group are much more positive. So there's something going on behind the scenes there in terms of those numbers. The numbers are also slightly different when you look at Scotland. There's less enthusiasm for the monarchy there than in England and Wales. And of course, it's different in Northern Ireland, where one of the two leading parties is avowedly Republican. If you look at the numbers for the Commonwealth, and you asked me earlier about the Commonwealth and their presence, it seems to be fairly evenly divided between a favourability towards the monarchy and favourability towards establishing the republic. And that seems to reflect countries' own sense of identity and where they've arrived at, and whether that's best expressed by having a king over the water or their own president. And it's also affected by attitudes to colonialism and the identification of the crown with the early colonial activity in countries such as Canada, such as Australia.
Peter Knowles is C-SPAN's producer in Great Britain, joining us from London. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And on this Cinco de Mayo holiday, President Biden tweeting, Cinco de Mayo is a day to celebrate the resilience, culture, and heritage of generations of Mexican Americans. The story of America is the story of them, and the White House is their house. Happy Cinco de Mayo. And President Biden and Vice President Harris making a trip to Northeast Washington to Taqueria Habanero, a Mexican restaurant. The White House says the president ordered a chicken quesadilla, churros, and an assortment of tacos for White House staff. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night and weekend.